The most basic division of a computer system is between the hardware and the software. Hardware is often described as the physical parts of a computer that you can actually touch with your hands, although that is not recommended, especially when the power is on. Software includes all the programmed instructions in a computer. There is the main program, called the system software, also known as the operating system, which controls and interacts with the hardware and software components. Application software are programs like Photoshop, Internet Explorer, and World of Warcraft. The main hardware components include the CPU, or central processing unit, main memory, secondary storage devices, and the input and output devices. The CPU is a microchip that receives and decodes instructions from memory. Within the CPU are specialized units. One is the arithmetic logic unit. This part performs operations with numbers. The control unit manages the flow of instructions in time with the CPU clock. The faster the CPU clock, the more instructions that can be processed at a time. The processor I have is a quad-core. That means that there are 4 copies of the same transistor circuitry within one chip. With 4 cores, my processor can execute 4 times as many instructions at a time than if it only had 1 core. The main memory is volatile. That means whatever data is held here would be lost if the power went off. Volatile memory needs a constant flow of electricity to work, so it's only used for instructions in active use. Otherwise, data is stored in a permanent storage device like the hard drive. The main memory can be imagined as a sequence of cells that are either empty or contain instructions or data. Each cell has its own unique address. In the actual hardware, electrical signals of on and off represent all computer information. These on and off signals are called bits. The hardware of a computer is like a kitchen. It includes all the equipment necessary for cooking food, as well as an energy source and location for performing the processes of cooking. The kitchen is where the ideas of a recipe are translated into edible meals. Like software, a recipe is just a series of written instructions that tell you how to turn raw ingredients into a culinary masterpiece. By itself, a recipe is a useless piece of writing, but as soon as the recipe is interpreted and executed, the recipe has value as a functional tool that can be used again and again to produce the same result. Software is reusable. The instructions of software control the flow of data.
Hey guys, how's it going? Here from HI Utilities.
Hey, it's me, Ramit.
Alright, so today we're going to be talking about PCI and what it is.
Yep, PCI is effectively how you would connect most items to the motherboard which are not actually part of the motherboard, nor are they normally vital. For example, a Wi-Fi card is not vital, but it is preferable. Same as graphics cards or even sound cards if you're insane.
Yeah, I think the main port of PCIe is for expansion. You know, you put things into there which you want to add to your system. So PCI pretty much has three versions. You have the 1-link rate, you have the 2-link rate, and you have the 12-link rate. Now, I'm pretty sure anyone can tell you that the 12-link rate is much better. This is because there's 12 lanes, and what that effectively means is that there's 12 more lanes where data can be transferred. So there's 12 more cycles that you can do compared to the 1-link rate where only one thing can happen at a time, so receiving and sending.
PCI, PCIe, depends on which one. I'm pretty sure, if I'm wrong, correct me on this. PCI is normal, whereas PCIe is express, isn't it?
Yes,
So,
yes.
yeah, that means that effectively PCIe is smaller, more compact, and better for smaller motherboards, and it also limits the things you can add to it. So, for example, you're not really going to want to put a graphics card that's 4 gigs dedicated on a PCIe port because you won't be able to optimize the graphics card properly.
Not necessarily. All PCI ports are the same. It's the device itself that is PCI Express. So, for example, the connector is always 12 lane, but the device could be PCI. Or normally, graphics cards are PCIe.
Yeah, and the thing is, not really, if you want more PCIe, you're gonna have to trade something else off. Unless, of course, you want to get a really large motherboard.
There are many things you can actually do with PCI.
Indeed, yeah. The limits are potentially, it's limitless, really. Mainly because, yes,
Continue.
I think my basic logic has gone. I really shouldn't have accepted that eclair from that person during concert. Yep.
Better cut
Shut up.
some of this out. So,
Uh,
go.
Yeah, PCIe, fantastic things, quite limited, but, and I'm pretty sure this is fine, they can be quite helpful for people who record videos. For example, us.
Yeah.
Can you think of any
Yeah. There's something called the NVIDIA SLI. Crossfire for you ATI idiots out there. Effectively, what it allows you to do is link two graphics cards together. What this allows you to do is it pretty much allows you to harness the full potential of your graphics cards, allowing you to make it more efficient when using your PC. Something that laptop users know nothing about because they don't have any PCI ports.
There are some which do, but the PCI ports are tiny. Well, they're more likely A to be PCIe, and secondly, well, they're just not very useful on a laptop. And anyway, if you want a proper future-proof laptop, then you just get a really powerful one.
The thing with PCI is that it's backwards compatible. So say you have a one-way PCI card that can fit in a 12-way port. So no matter what, as long as you have a large connector, you're always going to be able to fit your devices in as
Indeed, yeah.
amount.
Yeah, so, for the example, we're going to take my uncle's old computer. Again. No, oh god, this time that's nice. Now, his computer had 4 PCI ports, but the thing is they were 1-lane PCI ports. There might have been 4 of them, but really they're terrible. And, well, that's the problem with older ones. You can't well, so for example, if you have something optimized for 12 port, you're not going to get enough from lower port.
Yeah, so effectively all you guys really need to know is that PCI is good, it's fast, it makes your computer more efficient, and if you have the right stuff, it can make your computer more powerful.
And not just more powerful, you can make it more useful.
Yeah. That's pretty much it for this episode, guys. If you have any questions about PCI or have anything for us to answer, drop down in the comments. Guys, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and I'll catch you later. Peace.
Goodbye.
Accelerated/Advanced Graphics Port, littéralement port graphique accéléré/avancé en français, de sigle AGP, est un port interne destiné exclusivement aux cartes graphiques. Successeur pour ces périphériques du bus PCI, l'AGP permet aux informations de circuler plus rapidement. Ce standard de bus local fut lancé par Intel en 1997 pour s'affranchir du bus PCI qu'il estimait trop lent pour l'affichage en 3D car il assurait seulement une vitesse de 132 mégaoctets/s et voyait, de plus, sa bande passante réduite par le nombre de périphériques qu'il devait contrôler. L'AGP 32 bits relie le contrôleur graphique au contrôleur de mémoire et en offrant une vitesse de 500 mégaoctets/s, avec une horloge à 66 MHz, mais les informations sont transférées sur les deux fronts. Le bus AGP donne également accès à la mémoire centrale, via le contrôleur de mémoire, ce qui permet d'utiliser celle-ci pour stocker des données graphiques supplémentaires, telles que des textures ou des coordonnées. Ainsi, il devient inutile d'acquérir de la mémoire vidéo supplémentaire pour bénéficier pleinement des fonctions 3D d'un circuit vidéo. Le port AGP se décline en plusieurs variantes avec compatibilité ascendante et dont les fréquences sont des multiples X de l'AGP de base. AGP un XBU 32 bits à 66 MHz permettant un taux de transfert maximal de 266 mégaoctets/s, obtenu en doublant la fréquence de 33 MHz du bus PCI, tension de signalisation de 3,3 V, AGP 2 XBU 32 bits à 66 MHz DDR permettant un taux de transfert maximal de 533 mégaoctets/s, même tension de signalisation de 3,3 V que l'AGP 1X, AGP 4 XBU 32 bits à 66 MHz QDR permettant un taux de transfert maximal de 1066 mégaoctets/s, un Go/s, tension de signalisation à 1,5 V, AGP 8XBU 32 bits à 66 MHz à fréquence octuple, permettant un taux de transfert maximal théorique de 2133 mégaoctets/s, de Go/s, tension de signalisation de 0,85. Néanmoins, en pratique, ces vitesses ne sont pas confirmées, à cause du DMA, Direct Memory Access, souvent limité à 100 MHz. De plus, il existe des problèmes de compatibilité entre les différentes générations, les cartes graphiques consommant de plus en plus d'énergie. Les cartes AGP 4 fois et plus ne fonctionnent plus sur les ports AGP 1 fois. D'ailleurs, un détrompeur a été placé sur ces cartes. Pourtant, ces interfaces ne sont que partiellement exploitées, car c'est surtout la vitesse de la mémoire graphique qui s'avère insuffisante. Ainsi, les cartes graphiques, haut de gamme, utilisent souvent des mémoires de technologie supérieure à la mémoire centrale.
When you think about influential inventions or innovations in the history of computers, what comes to mind? Windows? The Mac? iPod? Well, there is certainly one interface that many people don't think of, the USB, or Universal Serial Bus. Well, what is USB? And who invented it? Well, what is its purpose? To fully understand USB, we have to first understand its history. Back in the early 1990s, when USB was unexistent, setting up devices to a computer was a pain in the... People had to deal with several types of cables, most of which were not interchangeable and had inadequate capabilities. Even to connect a few common devices, such as a monitor, printer, mouse, keyboard, and speakers, took 5 different cables. Normal computers had only 2 serial ports, and a parallel port which was slow and often had to accommodate for far more than it could handle. It was simply a big hassle. So, the 7 big computer and technology companies at the time, Compaq, DEC, IBM, Intel, Microsoft, NEC, and Nortel, came together to create a connection interface that was universal, fast, and could be used for a multitude of purposes. Within a year of development, the Universal Serial Bus version 1.0 was released. This newborn design had many good things standing for it. It could be used for multiple functions, it had plug-and-play and hot swapping capability, and it also had fast data transfer rates. Lastly, it was available on most new computers. But what was most important was that it brought connecting devices to a whole new level of simple. You connect a USB plug to your computer, and in most cases, that's all there is to it. If the computer doesn't recognize the device, it'll ask to install a driver for it. So how does this technology work? Inside your standard USB 2.0 cable are 4 wires, one for upstream data, one for downstream data, one for power, and one ground. USB allows transference of simultaneous upstream and downstream data packets between the host and the device, meanwhile providing 5 volts of power. The architecture of a USB system is a special one. It includes the host, such as a PC, television, or gaming console, the USB device, and the USB cable that connects the two. The relationship between the host and the device is called a master-slave connection. The PC, or the host, is the master and decides what happens, and the slave, or the device, listens. The host has 2 types of responsibilities, hardware and software. Hardware responsibilities include detecting USB connections and disconnections, providing electrical power to the connected devices, and controlling the transfer of data between the host and the device. Software responsibilities include handling the USB devices and their connectivity, configuring the USB devices, running the device's drivers, and managing power levels and bandwidth. You all think you know what a USB plug looks like, but what you're thinking is only the most common one. The one you know is the standard A plug, which is what you plug into your computer. This specific type of end draws power and is the host. Other types of USB connectors include the B connector, micro A, micro B, and mini B. These connect to the device. They do not draw power, nor do they have the power to send instructions. Stop and think for a second. Have you ever seen a USB cable which both ends had an A connector? You probably haven't, because it's very rare. The reason there are no dual A connector cables is because both would draw 5 volts of power from the host, creating power supply problems. Now that we understand how USB works, we must ask ourselves, how has USB impacted us? It may seem simple, but in reality there are more answers than just the obvious. Let us start with the positive side. Evidently, USB has nearly completely taken over as the status quo for peripheral connections due to its increased accessibility for hundreds of devices. If the average person was instructed to connect a keyboard to the purple 6-pin mini DNI port, a mouse to the green PS2 port, a PDA to a serial port, and a printer to a parallel port, he'd be left completely confused only to ask for a repetition of the instructions. The thing with USB is, you don't have to be a tech wizard to know how to use it. It has become basic computer knowledge to know about USB. One standard connection connects all your devices. We've all seen and recognized this infamous logo. We know it just as well as the Apple logo or the Nike logo. The USB Trident logo is branded on every single one of the 10 billion plus USB compatible devices sold on this planet. That's right, more than 10 billion. Well, if the USB really has become a universal standard, what kind of devices use it? What better way to emphasize my point than to list a whole bunch of them? Mice, keyboards, cell phones, tablets, desktops, laptops, speakers, mass storage devices, printers, monitors, scanners, wireless network sticks, joysticks, webcams, digital cameras, modems, and network connections. I'm not finished. Slipper heaters, heated gloves, vibrators, eye massagers, massage balls, dog tags, humidifiers, and even a grill? This list just goes to show you how versatile and ubiquitous USB really is. iPods and iPhones. The average iPhone or Mac owner owns at least 10 devices in their homes that use USB as a medium of connection. In fact, all Apple products themselves use USB. This one connection allows users to do all of that. Now that you think about it, it's pretty remarkable, isn't it? Now onto negative social impacts. None. The USB platform has literally done nothing that has impacted our society for the worse. And no, it made things simpler and therefore we have become lazy is not a valid answer. But, like all things great, the day will come where USB will crumble. And that will be caused by a little something called technological advancement. Right now, USBs are the way to go, but that's because they're the best thing we have. With wireless technology blooming and growing all around the world, it won't be long before all devices become wireless. Wireless printing, wireless monitors, wireless everything. And that, most certainly, will be the successor to our precious USB.
Information in a computer is stored as thousands of zeros and ones called bits. On a CD-ROM, bits are represented by microscopic holes and bumps called pits and lands. When a laser beam is reflected off of these tiny hills and valleys into a photodiode, they turn into an electrical pulse that a computer recognizes as a stream of zeros and ones, thus recreating words, images, and sounds.
Columbia is a great place to be. I think one of the strongest points is that it's in New York, and so it's a fun place to be. You have all kinds of culture, connections with industry.
In addition to being the cultural capital and media capital, we're also the financial capital of the world, and many of our students go on to careers in finance, taking advantage of our proximity to Wall Street.
There are a few places like New York where just the concentration of people of high ability level, whatever you're interested in, you can reach the top. And Columbia has that mentality.
There's something for everybody in New York, I think. There's cheap things, expensive things. There's music and theater and restaurants, and just very lively. I love it.
This is something that both the faculty and the students share. Everybody that came here had choices. And one of the reasons all of us came here, a very big reason, is because we wanted to be in New York City. And this is something that, it's a major factor, I think, in the bonding that goes on between faculty and the students. And if you just think about the kind of person that wants to come to New York City, it really is a special kind of person. It's an outgoing person, it's a very social person, and so to have that filter on the scientists that we bring into this university is just an incredible strength. Columbia has managed to create a college campus, a real college campus in an urban setting. I think that this campus and the city really do set us apart from other institutions.
The transition coming here was actually very smooth. I sort of expected that it would be something bigger, you know, something, oh no, I'm going to college. I think it was actually probably Columbia's campus that sort of made me feel pretty at home, because although you're in the city, the campus sort of isolates itself, and it really gives you sort of a home within the city, which is really, really nice.
Also within the department, I think the faculty are very caring, willing to spend time with students, wanting students to become involved.
There's nothing better than working with students. If I do my job right, when the students get out of here, they're better than me in their fields, and this is great. I love when my students argue with me and point out to me where I'm wrong, where they thought of something I haven't.
Professor Belvin, with his friend Bill Cheswick, wrote the book on firewalls, literally wrote the book on it. I mean, there's a book called Firewalls, and his name's on it. It just gets me every time. And these are the people you get to work with.
I can pick a room at random, walk into any lecture hall I want at any given time of the day, and see one of the world's greatest minds talking about what it is that they've devoted their life to.
And all these people teach seminar classes. How often do you get taught network security by the guy who basically redefined how to secure networks, 10 years ago when he was a graduate student?
I think Columbia offers at least two strengths that are hard to find elsewhere. One is that all of our undergraduates participate in the core curriculum and pick up all the insights and knowledge that the core curriculum can offer across the humanities and the sciences. So I believe that provides our students with an extremely broad basis that they can build on. I think this is particularly appropriate for a foundational discipline such as computer science, where it is hard to predict where one might end up 10 and 20 years from now. The second aspect, which I think is unique, is because we are a research-oriented department and have a relatively small undergraduate body, all of our faculty are actively involved with undergraduates, either in an advising, small group teaching, or research supervising role. Having a small program also allows us to have very small classes. So most of our advanced classes, certainly in the senior level, are typically 20 to 30 students, allowing for very close interaction between faculty, PhD students, and undergraduate students.
The higher level electives are master's level. There are a lot of master's students in the department, and undergraduate students take some of the same courses. So they're really challenged. They're working with people who've been in industry for a while. So you graduate from the computer science department here, and you really are ready.
We have a lot more students interested in solving problems computationally in a broader context than one particular area, which is something that we encourage. And this allows students a certain amount of versatility when they graduate. Here at Columbia, we're not in the business of producing future Dilberts. We produce future leaders. They have to break the stereotypes, and we're relying on them to do that.
That's why I do this wonderful diagram. Sorry for the mobile drawings here. Not very good with the mouse and drawing. But pretty much what cache is a temporary storage bin for data that's through your RAM, your primary RAM, which would be your DDR, whatever, 3, or whatever you use in your memory, your primary memory. And that processes that information, and then it goes to the hard drive where, depending on what you're doing, I don't know, if you're storing a file, if you're writing a file, whatever you're doing in the CPU, that's where it goes. But cache is for smaller files that the computer recognizes that it's going to reuse later in programs and functions. I don't know what you're doing, but like on web browsing, if it's an image on a website you always go to, it'll store that in cache. The next time you visit the website, it loads faster. Now, cache comes in 3 different levels, L1, L2, and L3, which is level 1, level 2, and level 3. Now, the difference between these is a little different than what you think. L1 is actually the fastest one you can have, and L3 is the slowest. But you think, oh, well, why would, I mean, it sounds like L1 is the oldest, and now they have L2 and L3, which why would they be faster? Well, I read up online, and this guy actually, I'm going to steal his analogy, or whatever you want to call it. I got a very good point here. He said, imagine it as the cache is like you're eating food, and say you're on the couch. L1 would be like a bag of chips. It's instant, it's really fast, but it's very small, and you cannot hold a lot in it. It's just one small bag of chips. Now L2 would be larger. It would be the kitchen. So imagine you're eating food, and you need resources, and it's in the kitchen. Now you're going to have to get up and go to the kitchen, so it's going to be a little bit slower to get the data, or the food in this case. But the kitchen is a lot larger, it can hold a lot more food. Now L3, which would be the basement or the cellar where you keep any extra food, that is humongous compared to the bag of chips in L1. It's a lot larger, it can hold a lot more information, data, or food, and then you can go in there, but it's going to take longer. It's going to be slower. So that's probably the best analogy I can think of when I stole offline. But I think it's the best one out there to help you understand. So basically, if you have an L1 cache, that is your bag of chips. That is super fast, but you cannot hold a lot in it. So if there's more information that can be held there, the computer moves it to L2. And L2 is like the kitchen, which is a little bit bigger, but it's a little bit slower. And if there's even more information needed to be carried, it goes to L3, which is the largest amount of cache, or level of cache. It can hold the most, but it is the slowest out of all 3 of them. It is, but here's one thing that you need to understand, and I should have pointed out earlier. All of this cache runs faster than it would to the RAM. Now, instead of your CPU processing this information and going to the RAM, it would process it and it would cache it to your cache memory. I don't really know how to draw cache, but let's say this is your cache. Oh.
Hey YouTube, this is MaxComTips, and today I was just going to do a quick little video on explaining what hyperthreading is. There's a lot of people talking about hyperthreading, whether it's better to have more threads, more cores, what all that's about, so I'm just going to explain this. And I have some diagrams already drawn up here for you just to save some time. I'm going to start with this one over here. I have an example here where you have 2 processors, and your hyperthreading, that's going to be the blue block. These are going to be the cores, these squares inside, and these are the processors. Now, the red is the physical, and the blue is going to be the logical or virtual, they call it. And whereas certain, like Intel, they've designed this, by the way, hyperthreading, where you have one core, but you have multiple threads going to that core. Generally two, so it looks like you have two processors for every one core you have. Like processor 1 on a computer would show up as 2 cores, even though it's only 1 core here, and that's the virtual core. Now the way this works is, let's say you have, okay, let's focus on these guys over here. Let's say you have 4 workers and they each have 1 arm. I know this is weird, just bear with me. They each have 1 arm. These are going to represent each one of your cores, okay? They're all one processor, and this is a quad core, let's say. Each of them are workers, and they each have 1 arm, which is their core, and they're lifting, like, I don't know, boxes. These would be the programs they're transferring over the computer and stuff they're moving. Now, when you use hyperthreading, it's kind of like adding a second arm to each one of these dudes. They each get another thread. Now they're the same resource, the same dude, but now they have 2 threads. So now both these arms are using the same resource, the body, the muscle of the dude. They're using the same resource, but they're doing other jobs. Now, some people can say this is good or bad, depending.
One of the key components inside of our computers is the memory. We're usually referring to memory as the random access memory, the amount of total RAM storage that you might have for that computer. But there's all kinds of different memory inside of your computer. When we're commonly talking about memory, we're usually talking about the RAM, but there may be occasions where we're talking about certain types of memory that aren't specifically associated with the RAM types that we'll discuss in this video. Another thing to keep in mind is your RAM memory is not the same as your hard drive storage or other storage device that you might have on your computer. Of course, we're using the same type of measurement system for those. We talk about our memory sticks being a 4 gig or an 8 gig memory stick, and we're talking about hard drive space also in gigabytes, so it's very common to mix those up if you aren't exactly sure what you're talking about. But make sure when somebody says, I have 8 gig in my computer, are they referring to how much memory they have in their computer, or are they referring to some type of storage device inside of your computer? Sometimes people will use those interchangeably, and of course those are very, very different things. Memory is so important in our computers because the only time you can perform a calculation on anything is if you get that into the memory of your computer. So it's very common for us to pull files off of our hard drive, and the only time we can execute them or perform any type of calculations is when we have it in active memory. And we might perform some calculations, we might modify a graphics file, we might work on a spreadsheet, and then we will save that back to the hard drive for later. But the only time we can ever work with it, the only time we can ever execute a file, the only time we can run a program is when we have that information in the memory of your computer. One of the kinds of memory we often don't directly refer to is memory like read-only memory. This is very common to see when we are storing our BIOS information, for instance, onto our computer. This BIOS is something that we generally don't change, and so it is a read-only memory in the way that we use it. Read-only memory has many different types that you would see in a computer. A very old type is a PROM, a programmable read-only memory. That's one where we would program the chip itself, we would fasten it to the motherboard, and it's always going to have that particular code burned into that particular chip. There's also an EPROM, which is one that is the same as a PROM, but we can erase it if we have the right equipment. We would remove that chip from the motherboard, we would place it into our burning device so we can put different types of information on that chip, and then we would replace it onto the motherboard. Again, you'd have to physically remove it from the motherboard generally to have that happen. In most of our computers today, especially when we're dealing with the BIOS configuration of our computer, we're talking about EEPROM. This is electrically erasable programmable. When we talk about CPUs and we talk about processors inside of our computer, we often refer to static RAM. This is not read-only memory, and it's not the memory stick RAM that we would put in our computer. This is a very, very specialized type of memory that is very, very fast. It's so fast that it's exactly what we would like to use in the calculation process inside of our processors. The problem is that this very, very fast memory is very, very expensive. Otherwise, we'd be using it for everything. We can only use a small part of it because of the costs involved with this static RAM. It's also relatively large. We're looking at a CPU die right here. The static RAM are these large sections where all of this looks very similar. It's like we're looking at something from a plane, and every time you see these little fields of information, those are generally static RAM sections. Usually it's a layer 1, a layer 2, a layer 3 cache that is right there on the CPU itself. This static RAM is named static because we don't have to constantly refresh the contents of the memory. Dynamic random access memory. This is dynamic memory because we constantly have to refresh this memory to maintain the information that's inside of it. If we were not going to refresh this data, it would ultimately disappear and completely wipe out everything that was inside of this memory. That's a little different than the static memory we were just looking at, where you write it, and as long as there's constant power, it's always going to be there. That's not the case with dynamic memory. We always have to provide those updates. Otherwise, one type of dynamic random access memory is one called synchronous dynamic random access memory, or SDRAM. SDRAM is not static RAM. We have an S in front of that, but the S in this case stands for synchronous dynamic random access memory. It's synchronous because the memory itself is synchronized with the clock rate of the memory bus. We have to make sure those are synchronized together so that they stay in sync and we can constantly refresh and access all of the information that we need from inside of that memory. We don't see SDRAM on a lot of our modern systems. Generally, we see DDR type memory. We'll talk about that in a moment. But if you are going to acquire or replace some existing SDRAM inside of one of your computers, you'll notice that the SDRAM is labeled with the same speed as your memory clock bus. So if you have a memory clock bus, as our computers matured through the years, we needed to make sure that the speed of our memory was keeping up with the faster and faster processors that were created. By the time the Pentium 4 came along, we were hitting the limits of what that traditional SDRAM was going to be able to do for us. So a third party called Rambus created a new type of memory that could go much faster. And they partnered with Intel so that you could create some motherboards that would require this Rambus dynamic random access memory. The advantage, of course, is that this memory is much faster than the older SDRAM. One of the disadvantages, of course, is that because it was created by a third party and a number of licensing requirements were there, that it was more expensive than traditional memory that we were using in the past. And so now you had a balancing act of needing to go faster, but this Rambus memory also required additional money. And that was a balancing act that most people had to determine if it made sense for them. Not all systems use this Rambus memory, and as you'll see in a moment, we evolved to have even faster memory types that were not created by the Rambus Incorporated. Generally, our modern memory types are based on double data rate synchronous dynamic random access memory. This DDR SDRAM is one that we see very, very commonly. The first one that we had come out was simply DDR RAM, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. It was able to go twice the rate of the older SDRAM, thus the double data rate associated with it. If we were to look at, for instance, a memory bus clock of 100 megahertz, we used what we called a bus clock multiplier of 1. We multiplied that by the clock rate. This is a dual rate memory, so we'd multiply it by 2, and then we'd multiply it by 64 to represent the number of bits that you can transfer in a single cycle. And of course, we wanted that represented as bytes, so we would divide it by the number of bits per bytes. And that gives us this calculation of 12,800 divided by 8, which meant the total peak data rate for a 100 megahertz bus clock rate was 1,600 megabytes per second as a peak data. If we had a PC 1600 data rate and you were trying to determine what the original memory bus clock rate was, you could simply take that 1600 number and divide it by 16, and ultimately that would give you 100 megahertz. The next generation of DDR memory was called DDR2. This is the double data rate 2 SD-RAM, and there were a number of enhancements associated with it. We had the ability to handle more interference. We had buffers built into this. There were drivers off chip. It was the next generation of DDR memory. It also was twice as fast. So we would take our original 100 megahertz bus clock rate. Notice that our bus clock multiplier changes to 2. All of this numbers stay the same after that. A dual rate of 2, 64 bits transferred, and you divide everything by 8. So your total number is 25,600 divided by 8, which is a total peak data rate of 3,200 megabytes per second. DDR2 memory is designated by PC 2. It has that 2 right after it, and the 3200 is referring to the peak data rate. The magic number here for DDR2 memory then would be the number 32. If we take that 100 megahertz and simply multiply it by 32, we can skip all of these other equations and we can simply come up with 3200. And conversely, we can take 3200 divided by 32 and get our memory bus clock rate of 100 megahertz. The latest generation of DDR memory is DDR3, and as you can expect, it's twice the data rate of DDR2. We even have much larger modules that we can use in our computers today. The formula, very, very similar. The only thing you're really changing is the bus clock multiplier, which means you can take your 100 megahertz memory clock rate, and once you do the equation, you come up with a peak data rate of 6,400 megabytes per second. And we can see here that we put a 3 on the end of the PC3 to designate that this is DDR3 memory, and then our peak data rate of 6,400. That means that that magic number that you can use instead of going through that big set of equations is that you can take the 100 megahertz clock rate and simply multiply it by 64 to come up with 6,400 megabytes per second as your peak data rate. And of course, you can conversely do this by dividing 64 from your 6,400 peak data rate to give you 100 megahertz. So if you're given a question where you need to calculate either your peak data rate or you need to calculate the original memory bus clock rate of a particular set of DDR, DDR2, or DDR3 memory, just remember your magic numbers, and you'll simply multiply or divide for the appropriate magic number of the memory type that you're using. Even though these types of memory are numbered DDR and DDR2 and DDR3, you cannot use different types of memory on different motherboards. You can't take a DDR2 memory and use it on a motherboard that's designed for DDR3. Even if you try to do that, you'll notice that it doesn't fit onto the motherboard. So if you're moving memory around and you notice it's not quite going into the slot, there are these sections on the memory that are designed to fit right into a key that is on the memory slot itself. This ensures that when we are plugging memory in, that we're not using the wrong memory type on that motherboard. It should fit perfectly, and if it doesn't, you may want to look at the tiny little slot that is in your memory and make sure it lines up with the plastic key that is inside the memory slot on your motherboard.
All right, so now let's talk about what virtual memory is. And I'll give you a hint here. Virtual memory is all about indirection. Remember, we mentioned that there are different address spaces for the program and the memory, and virtual memory is about the indirection pointing between them. So, virtual memory is a layer of indirection. And this comes from the general idea that any problem in computer science can be solved by adding indirection. If you got a problem, add a layer of indirection and we can almost always solve it. Let's take a look at how this works in virtual memory. So without virtual memory, we don't have indirection. The program address that the program uses in MIPS is exactly the same as the RAM address. So if the program tries to load from address 1024, it's going to look for RAM address 1024. So here's our 32-bit address space the program guarantees, and here's our 32-bit address space if we only have 1 gigabyte of RAM in our computer. And we saw before these addresses are fine. Address 0 is going to map over here to 0, 1 to 1, etc., all the way through the first gigabyte. But what happens is when we start using addresses that are beyond the first gigabyte, they don't have anywhere to map to. So with this direct mapping here, we're going to crash if we try to access more memory. So virtual memory is going to solve this by adding a level of indirection. So in virtual memory, we're going to take the program addresses and map them to a RAM address. So instead of going 1 to 1 like this, we're going to have a slightly different mapping. So here's virtual memory, and it's going to do this mapping. So we have our 32-bit program address space. We still only have 1 gigabyte of memory installed in our computer, but now we're going to have this map in the middle. And this map is going to provide exactly this indirection that I was talking about before. So let's see how this can work with a map. So here's address 0. Where's it going to go to? Well, we look in the map. The map sends it over here to RAM address 1. Okay, why not? It can map it to anywhere it wants. Here comes the next one. It maps it up here to address 0. Okay, sure. Here comes the next one. It maps it into here. Now we've done the same thing we've done here. We've mapped everything. It's not the same mapping, but it's just a mapping. What happens now when we access this next piece of data? Well, now that we have a map, this next piece of data can say, hey, it's not in memory. It's somewhere else. It's on the hard disk, for example. So our program's not going to crash. It's going to know it has to go get the data from the hard disk before it can continue. So what virtual memory does here is it gives us flexibility in how we can use our memory here. So this mapping allows us to use our memory in a more flexible way. So let's take a look at how virtual memory solves these three problems that we looked at before. So here's our same 32-bit address program space and our same 1 gigabyte 30-bit RAM address space. So we have 1 gigabyte of memory installed, and MIPS promises 4 gigabytes of memory space to every program. Now we've got this map in the middle, and we've got a disk over here where we can put stuff that doesn't fit. So let's take a look at this. We're going to map some of the program's address space to disk when it doesn't fit, and when we need it, we'll bring it into memory. So here we are with virtual memory, and remember the program address is going to map to the RAM addresses. So the program goes and tries to load address 0, goes to the map says, okay, address 0 is over here, no problem, you can access it. So the virtual memory has mapped program address 0 to RAM address 1. Now the program wants to access address 1. Okay, so we go into the map, and the map goes over here, and it maps address 1 to RAM address 0. No problem. Go to program address 2, it goes and maps it down here. That's fine. Now here's where it gets fun. So now we try to load the program address 3, the next one here. And this one doesn't fit into the amount of memory we have here. So this part here took up our first gigabyte of memory. Now we're trying to load something beyond 1 gigabyte. What's going to happen? Well, when you do this, you go to the map, and the map says, hey, I don't have any more space in your memory that's installed in your computer for this data. What am I going to do? But because I have this flexibility, I can move the data around. So it's going to go put it on the disk now. So virtual memory is going to find the oldest piece of data in memory. In this case, it's this 01 here. It's going to go and move it out to the disk. This is called a page out. It's taking this page of memory and writing it out to disk. Then it's going to go and update the map. So the map here still says that this is in memory. I'm going to update that map to say, nope, it's not in memory. It's on disk. Now that we've freed up this memory here, now we can go ahead and access program address 3 here and put it in the memory that we freed up from that earlier data. So by having this mapping, we can use our disk to give us the illusion of unlimited memory. So as long as we have 4 gigabytes of space on our disk, we can always give every program 4 gigabytes of memory because we can do this mapping and put as much of the data on the disk as we need to. So that's how virtual memory solves the problem of not enough memory. Now here's a question about virtual memory performance. What's going to happen to the program performance when the data it needs is on the disk? Well, we're going to get really bad performance. Reading from disks is slow. Disks are thousands of times slower than memory. So if we have to put the data on the disk, it's going to slow down our performance enormously. This is why people tell you if you buy more memory for your computer, it'll run faster, because you'll have less time you have to go to the disk to access data. Now let's take a look at how we solve problem number 2. This was the holes in the address space. So remember, we quit program number 1 up here, and it left these two 1 gigabyte holes, and we decided we couldn't run program 3 because it didn't fit into either of these holes. Now we're going to have this map so we can be more flexible in how we use the memory. So here's program 3 and program 2. Here's program 2's map, and as we saw, program 2 was mapped into the middle chunk of memory here. But with virtual memory, we can map program 3 wherever we want. So here's program 3's map. We're going to take the first part of program 3, and we'll map it up here. We'll take the second part of program 3, and we'll map it down here. So now program 3's memory is split around programs 2's. But it doesn't matter because this mapping allows us to map any part of program 3's memory to any part of our real memory. So we got this added flexibility from having these mapping, and now we could fill up these holes and really use all of our memory. So with each program having its own mapping, we can put our data wherever we want, and we can be more flexible about using these holes in memory. So let's take a look at the third problem here, keeping programs secure. So here's program 1 and program 2. And remember what's going to happen. Program 1 is going to store your bank balance at address 1024, and Program 2 is going to store your video game at address 1024. So we're going to use maps for them to put them in different RAM addresses. So Program 1 has a map, and Program 2 has a map. Program 1 is going to go to address 1024, and its map is going to send the data somewhere. So in this case, we're sending the data over here to RAM address 1. Okay, so it writes to RAM address 1. Program 2 is also going to try and access address 1024, but its map is going to send the data somewhere else. So in this case, it's going to send it over here to RAM address 5. So now they write to different places because we have these mappings that make sure, even though each one of them is trying to access 1024, they have different mappings that send them to different physical locations in memory, and they don't overwrite. So neither one of them can touch the other one, and we've got this security. They each have their own address space, and they can't access each other's maps as long as we don't map them over each other. So here's a question about program isolation. So we just showed you how you can isolate programs here. Is this always good? If you completely isolate the programs, what's the downside of this? So the downside of this, if you do it entirely, is you can't share data. So programs often share a lot of data. But if I have this mapping where they're completely isolated, they can't share that. Now, we can use the same mapping to enable shared data. So say I have a mapping here that maps part of Program 1's addresses down here, and another mapping that maps part of Program's 2 addresses right here. Now they can explicitly share that same data regardless of where they need to access it. And this is actually very common. So if we take a look at this here, here's the save dialog box from my mail program, and here's the save dialog box from my web browser. You'll notice these are exactly the same. All of the code and all of the icons and graphics for both of these dialog boxes are the same. So you want these to be shared between each program. So the memory that represents these save dialog boxes, that's going to be shared between the two programs. So we need to make sure they can do the sharing. So save dialog box, fonts, graphics, all those things are examples of data that you want to share between programs. Now we're going to talk about page tables. And the page table is the mapping that keeps track of these virtual address to physical address mappings. And we're going to see in a minute why we call it a page table. So we saw before that we have this map from the virtual addresses to the physical addresses. We're going to call this the page table. What we've seen so far is we had one entry, or one page table entry, for every virtual address. So here we had one entry for address 512, one entry for 786, because we also had entries for all the words in between these as well. So how big is this? So if we need one entry in our page table for every virtual address, and remember virtual addresses are word access, how many do we need? Well, we need one for every word. So that's 2 to the 30 or 1 billion entries. So that means that this table here for a 32-bit program address space has to be able to fit 1 billion entries in it. And each one of these entries is pretty big. It has to say what's the virtual address and the physical address, so it's at least 32 bits. So that means this is about 1 gigabyte of memory just to keep track of this page table. So this doesn't sound very good. I mean, we'd have to use up a whole gigabyte of memory just to keep track of the memory for one particular program. So how are we going to solve this? Well, let's talk about page table size. So we need to translate every address. Our programs have a 32-bit virtual address space, and we have to be able to access everything in it, or the programs can't use all their address space. So it's 2 to the 30 words that need page table entries. If we have one entry for every word, it's 1 billion entries. That's way too many entries. Now remember, if we don't have a page table entry, then we can't access that location. We need the page table entry to get the physical address so we can actually load the data. So we have to have some sort of page table entry for every single word in our virtual address space. So how can we make this more manageable? Well, here's what we had before. We had this fine-grained mapping. Each word was mapped in our table here. What we can do is we can have it in bigger chunks. So we divide our memory into chunks, and we're going to call these chunks pages. That's why it's called a page table entry instead of words. So here's what this looks like with coarse grain. So here we have a whole page. So we're saying that virtual addresses 0 through 4095 are going to map to physical addresses, whatever, 4096 to 8191. So now instead of having one entry in our page table map one word, one entry in our page table is going to map this whole chunk of memory. And we're going to call this chunk of memory a page. So in this case, we have these 4 kilobyte pages. So each entry in our page table now handles 4 kilobytes of data. Before, we had each entry in our page table handling 1 word or 4 bytes of data. So this is now, each chunk here is 1,024 times larger than they were here, so we need 1,000th as many of these entries. Makes our page table much smaller. So now we're going to do this coarse-grained pages instead. So our page table is no longer going to manage entries for each word, it's going to manage entries for each page. So we have fewer entries needed to cover the whole address space. And here's the example. We had 4 kilobyte pages here. There's also a trade-off. It's less flexible. Before, we could move each word at a time. Here we're going to have to move 4,096 bytes at a time, 4 kilobytes every time we want to move a page. So if we need to move something out to disk to make room, we're going to have to move out 4,096 bytes at a time to make room. So today we typically have 4 kilobyte pages. It's 1,024 words per page. And here's a question about them. How many entries do we need in our page table now that we have 4 kilobyte pages for this 32-bit machine? Well, we need 1 entry for every 1,024 words. It's a 4 kilobyte page. Each word is 4 bytes, so that's 1,024 words per page. So that's going to be 1 million entries. So this is great. Instead of needing 1 billion entries like we did before, we just need 1 million. This is enormously more manageable. So before our page table was a gigabyte in size, now it's going to be about 4 megabytes in size, which is much more reasonable. And in fact, people even go further than this. So today you have lots of 64-bit machines. People are getting very common to use 2 megabyte pages. So in a 2 megabyte page, you get 520,000 words per page. This allows you to cover more of memory space with a smaller page table. So there's a trade-off here. Cover more memory space with a smaller page table, but you have to move a whole page at a time, so you get less flexibility. Well, the answer is going to be 4,100. So all of the virtual addresses in this range are going to be mapped into this physical page here. So address 4 over here is offset by 4 bytes from the start of this page. So we can figure out where this page maps. It maps over here. And then we know that this word is going to be offset by 4 bytes over here in this physical page. So it's going to be 4 bytes off from address 4,096, so it's going to be address 4,100.